Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yop online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 9 of the American Yop is called Getting Forward, and just like the first 8 chapters, it covers more content in just a few pages than most of us are probably comfortable with. The market revolution, canals and steamboats and the first factories, the Second Great Awakening and the Missouri Compromise. And running down the middle of all of it is one man, Andrew Jackson. You know his face, he's been on the $20 bill for almost a century. You know the outline of his story, too. The orphan who made himself a general, the hero of New Orleans, Old Hickory, the people's president. That story is true, mostly. And it is told well in the chapter and just about everywhere else. So I'm not going to retell it all today. What I want to do instead is look at the part of Jackson that the legend files down smooth. Because the same chapter that gives you Old Hickory the Democrat also gives you a single sentence. 270 people killed on his orders at a place most Americans have never heard of. Those two things are in the same man. And if you want to understand the country that chose him as president, you have to be willing to hold both those things at once. Let's start with one of my favorite stories to tell in my classroom. It begins on a dueling ground in Kentucky. It is the morning of May 30th, 1806. Two men are standing in a field on the bank of the Red River in Logan County, Kentucky, 24 feet apart. They have come here across the state line because dueling is illegal in Tennessee, where they happen to both live. The law already told them no. They rode all this way to get around it. One of the men is Charles Dickinson. He is 26 years old, a lawyer, a plantation owner, and by reputation, the finest pistol shot in Tennessee. He is said to have practiced on the road to Kentucky, leaving severed strings and playing cards nailed to trees behind him as a message. The other man, of course, is Andrew Jackson. He is 39 years old. He's a lawyer, a judge, and a militia general, and he is nowhere near the marksman Dickinson is. And he knows it. So Jackson has made a plan. And the plan is the coldest thing about this whole story. He has decided to let Dickinson shoot him first. Jackson has worked it out in advance with his second. He is wearing a loose frock coat, a size too big, to blur the exact line of his body against the morning light. He expects to be hit. He is betting that if he can just stay on his feet for the few seconds after, he can take slow, deliberate aim and kill Dickinson at his leisure. He is treating his own body as a thing to be spent. The word is given. Dickinson fires first. He is fast and he is accurate. The ball strikes Jackson directly in the chest, an inch or two from his heart. A puff of dust rises off the frock coat. But Jackson does not fall. He sways. He brings his left arm across his chest, clamps it down over the wound, and stands there. Dickinson, staring at a man he is certain he just shot through the heart, steps back and cries out,
"Great God! Have I missed him?"
He didn't miss. Jackson is standing there with a bullet next to his heart, holding himself together by sheer will. By the rules of the duel, Dickinson now has to return to his mark and stand still. He does, and he waits. Jackson raises his pistol and takes his aim. He pulls the trigger. The hammer stops at half-cock. The gun does not fire. Now, under the code of dueling, a misfire counted as your shot. It was over. Jackson had every customary reason to lower the pistol and walk away. Honor served, both men alive. But Jackson does not do that. He draws the hammer back again, calmly, all the way. He aims again at the man standing motionless in front of him, and he fires. The ball strikes Dickinson just below the ribs. He goes down, and he will bleed to death over the course of the day. And Jackson, blood now filling his own boot, turns and walks off the field. He hides how badly he is hit until he is out of sight of Dickinson's men, because he does not want them to have the satisfaction of knowing he landed the shot. The surgeon later tells him the ball is lodged too close to the heart to remove. Jackson will carry it in his chest for the next 39 years, the rest of his life. Years later, a friend asked Jackson how he managed to stay standing, to aim after taking a ball that close to the heart. Jackson's answer is the reason we're starting here. "I should have hit him," Jackson said, "if he had shot me through the brain." That line tells you who this man was. He was not saying he was brave. He is saying that killing Dickinson was going to happen no matter what Dickinson did to him first. A bullet to the heart would not have stopped it. A bullet to the brain would not have stopped it. The decision to kill had been made before either man arrived in the field that morning. And nothing, not even his own death, was going to change that. That is not hot temper. People like to describe Jackson as a hot-tempered man, quick to anger, a man of his rough time and place. But there was nothing hot about that morning. That morning was patient. It was planned. He absorbed a bullet on purpose to guarantee his aim. That is a cold, deliberate willingness to destroy another human being and to spend his own body doing it. Now, where does a man like that come from? The chapter tells you, and the story is genuinely a hard one. Andrew Jackson was born in 1767 in the Waxhaws, the back country on the border between the Carolinas, to immigrant parents from the north of Ireland. His father died before he was born. Then the revolution came through the back country, and the back country is where that war was at its ugliest. Neighbor against neighbor, no lines, and no mercy. Jackson was 13 years old when he joined up. He was captured, and this is the moment that made the legend. A British officer ordered the boy Jackson to clean his boots, and Jackson refused, and the officer swung a sword at his head. Jackson threw his hand up to block it, but failed. He carried the scars his entire life, one across his fingers and one across his scalp. Now, I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of story that gets polished in the retelling. The famous image of young Jackson defending the family home from a British soldier came decades later, printed up to sell the legend. The textbook itself notes that images like that established Jackson's legend. What we can say is that he was captured, that he was struck, and that he came out of that war carrying a wound and a hatred of the British that never left him. He lost everyone to the war. His two brothers died in the war, one of disease, the other from disease and neglect of captivity. His mother died nursing prisoners soon after. By the time he was 14, Andrew Jackson was an orphan with nothing but a set of scars and a deeply ingrained hatred. What he did next is the part Americans fell in love with. He went west to Frontier, Tennessee. He taught himself enough law to be admitted to the bar. He was rough, barely educated, and he clawed his way up anyway, into land, into a plantation, into money and standing. He made himself a recognized gentleman. I want to say the true thing about this very plainly, because it is a goal of this podcast that we do not flinch. The self-made part of Jackson was real, and it is genuinely part of why people loved him. He looked like proof that in America, a nobody could become a somebody. But the way he became a somebody was in large part by owning people. He would come to hold roughly 150 slaves in bondage at his plantation outside Nashville. The rise and the enslaving were not two separate facts about Jackson. They are the same fact. The property that made him a gentleman was, a great deal of it, people. Then came the war that made him a legend. In 1814, in a brutal campaign against the people we usually call the Creeks, Jackson won a crushing victory at Horseshoe Bend. A year later, in January of 1815, he stood outside New Orleans with a patched-together army. Backwoodsmen, free black soldiers, Choctaw fighters, a crew of pirates. And with them, he shattered a British invasion force, inflicting more than 2,000 casualties while barely losing a few hundred of his own. The war was technically already over. The peace treaty had been signed weeks earlier across the Atlantic, but that did not matter one bit to how it landed at home. America had been humiliated for 2 years. British troops had burned the Capitol and the president's house, and here was this scarred orphan kid from the Waxhaws handing the greatest army in the world the worst day it had ever had on this continent. He was the hero of New Orleans, and a country that badly needed a hero decided he was theirs. Now, here is the thing the chapter is quietly asking you to notice, and it is the whole reason we started on that dueling ground. The country did not choose Jackson in spite of what happened at that duel. It chose him because of the quality that that duel revealed. The tenacity, the refusal to fall, the absolute patient willingness to see a thing through to the end, no matter the cost to himself or to anyone else. On a dueling ground aimed at one man that quietly killed Charles Dickinson. In a few years, that same quality would be aimed at an army, and then at a nation. I want to show you what it looked like the first time it was pointed not at a marksman who had agreed to fight, but at a people who had simply tried to live free. We're calling this week's special segment The Fort by the River. The textbook chapter gives the story one sentence. I counted one sentence in a list of Jackson's Florida atrocities. So we're going to give it a little bit more than one sentence. On a bluff above the Apalachicola River, in what was then Spanish Florida, there stood a fort. The British had built it during the War of 1812, and then, when they left, they simply abandoned it, cannon and muskets and all. And into that fort, and the fields and the village that grew up around it, moved some of the people to which the British had promised freedom. People who had escaped slavery in Georgia and the Mississippi Territory. Formerly enslaved men and women, alongside Seminole and other native allies. They took up the land. They planted it. They armed the walls. They governed themselves. By 1815, it was, by some counts, the largest community of free black people anywhere in North America. Hundreds of people living along that river on their own terms, answering to no enslaver. White Americans across the border called it, with a sneer, the Negro Fort. What it was a haven. If you had escaped slavery in the American South, you knew there was a place down the river where you could be free. And so people came. Now, remember what we said in an earlier episode about a man named Boston King who ran toward the British lines during the Revolution because they were the only force on the continent offering him freedom. This is the same story, just one generation later. The same rivers of people moving toward the one place that would have them free. Except this time, the guns were pointed the other way. To the planters of Georgia, that fort was intolerable. Not because it attacked them, it mostly just sat there. It was intolerable because it simply existed. Because every day it stood was a day that enslaved people 90 miles away knew that freedom was real and it was reachable. Listen to how the American commander on that frontier, General Edmund Gaines, described the danger. He worried, in his own words, that the fort would produce much evil among the blacks of Georgia and the eastern part of the Mississippi Territory. Back that up and listen to that line again. The evil he is afraid of is not an attack. The evil is influence. The evil is the example. The danger of the fort was that free black people were living well within sight of enslaved ones. That is the thing that had to be destroyed. And the man whose military district that frontier belonged to was Andrew Jackson. The orders came down through Jackson, and they said the quiet part in writing. The goal of the operation, in the government's own language, was to restore the stolen Negroes to their rightful owners. Think about what those words are doing. The free people in that fort are described as stolen property. Their freedom is treated as a theft, and the mission of the United States Army is to give the property back. That is the racial bargain that we have been tracing across this whole volume so far, written out as a military order. A human being reaching for freedom is reclassified by the stroke of a pen as somebody else's stolen goods. In July of 1816, a force of American soldiers and Creek allies moved down the river and laid siege. The people in the fort raised a red flag, and above it, the British Union Jack, the flag of the promise that had brought them there. They refused to surrender. For days, the two sides exchanged fire, and the fort held. And then on the morning of July 27th, a Navy gunboat on the river heated a cannonball red hot in its galley furnace. A glowing shot. They fired it at the fort. It went over the wall and into the powder magazine where all the fort's gunpowder was stored. I'm going to let the man who commanded the assault, Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Clinch, describe what happened next. Not because his words are elegant, but because they are his. This is the officer who won the battle, writing his own report, and it is the most honest thing in the whole record.
The explosion was awful, and the scene horrible beyond description.
The blast was heard 150 miles away in Pensacola. It killed roughly 270 people in an instant. Men, women, and children. The great majority of everyone inside the walls, gone in a single sound. The survivors, and there were few, were mostly wounded. They were not freed. They were taken back and returned to slavery, some of them claimed by Georgia planters on the argument that they had once owned the survivors' parents. The fort's black leader, a man the record calls Garçon, survived the blast and was executed. And here's the last thing from Clinch's report And it is the line I have a hard time getting out of my head. Standing in the wreckage of a community he had just annihilated, looking at 270 corpses, the commander wrote,
"The great ruler of the universe must have used us as his own instrument."
His instruments. He looked at that and believed he saw the hand of God working through him. That is what the willingness to see a thing through to the end looks like when it is handed an army and a furnace. On the dueling ground, it was one man, patient, absorbing a bullet to make sure of his aim. Here, it is the same patience, the same certainty, the same refusal to be turned aside, pointed at a fort full of people whose only offense was that they had gotten free and wouldn't go back. When you open Chapter 9 of the American Yawp, you're going to spend most of it somewhere other than a dueling ground or a burning fort. You'll be in the canals and the mills and the revival tents. That is the market revolution, and it matters, and you should definitely read it closely. But watch for Jackson. He runs through the chapter, and the chapter tells you in one clear sentence what his rise meant. It says that Jacksonian politics would erode freedom for African Americans and Native Americans, even as it expanded some freedoms for poor whites. Now, do not idly read past that sentence. Underline it, highlight it, do something. Right? That is the trade at the center of this whole era, spelled out. Some people got more room to breathe. Others paid for that room with everything they had. Then read the chapter's conclusion and read it slowly because it is quietly one of the saddest things in the book. The Yawp tells you that these years, the 18 teens and the 1820s, did not begin the end of slavery. They ended the beginning of the end. The window that had opened during the Revolution, the window when Americans genuinely argued about whether slavery might wither away, completely closed in those years. After this, the chapter says, American progress would be impossible for many people to imagine apart from slavery. Think back to last episode. Robert Carter freed more than 500 people because for one narrow moment, Virginian law let him. That was the window. This is the chapter where that window shuts. The people in that fort on the Apalachicola reached for the same freedom a few years too late and on the wrong side of that closing door. So as you read, hold on to one question. This chapter is called Getting Forward. Ask yourself every few pages, forward for whom? When the canal reaches the lake and the mill hums and the country surges ahead, ask who is being carried forward and who is being sold down the river to pay for the trip. And keep your eye on Jackson. We're not done with him. The man who ordered the fort destroyed is going to be president soon, and what he did to a fort full of free people by a river is going to do, on a scale you can hardly stand to look at, to whole nations of native people. The Yawp will meet us there in a later chapter, at a road they will call the Trail of Tears. Chapter 9 of the American Yawp is available for free at americanyawp.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel, and this has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyawp.com to access your free online copy of the American Yawp textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.